With the Battle of the Eastern Solomons done, but the Guadalcanal Campaign far from over, Enterprise was heading back for the Guadalcanal area, patched up as best could be managed at the time, but also featuring an enhanced anti-aircraft battery, as the rather questionable 1.1-inch medium anti-aircraft guns had been replaced with some of the first 40mm Bofors guns to enter frontline US Navy service. She was ordered to join USS Hornet under the overall command of Admiral Halsey, who'd recovered enough to take command of the remaining USN forces in the area, but he would be based on New Caledonia, while Admiral Kincaid was in local control of the carriers themselves. But in some ways, Enterprise had kept in the fight, even while the ship itself was undergoing refit and repair, as a number of her pilots, particularly from VB-6, had either been left in the area when she departed, or had been quickly reassigned to nearby US bases, and thus they had continued to see action while their erstwhile mothership was in Pearl Harbor. Sadly, this meant that a number of veteran pilots had been lost when they'd volunteered to help build up the flight group of the Wasp, and then become victims of her apocalyptic destruction. On Guadalcanal itself, the last pilots of Flight 300 were only withdrawn at the end of September when they ran out of operational aircraft to fly, only to be replaced a couple of weeks later by other VB-6 pilots who'd flown in from other US Southwest Pacific bases. These soon struck up a solid friendship with the Marines and the Army personnel on Guadalcanal, as a mixture of casualties, illness, and fatigue meant that they were often recruiting rear gunners from pretty much anyone who happened to be nearby who didn't have an absurd fear of flying and who had nothing better to do. One particularly effective pairing was pilot Bill Pittman, who discovered a lonely tank gunner who knew nothing at all about aircraft other than they flew and tanks didn't, but did know almost everything there was to know about guns and how to shoot them, and appeared to be entirely unbothered when bits of the aircraft he was in were being chewed up by Japanese cannon fire, just as long as he could merrily blaze away with the tail guns in return. It would take 10 days for Enterprise to transit down to the combat area, and her new Carrier Air Group 10, took every daylight hour they could find to work up and familiarize themselves with their new ship. And it wasn't a moment too soon. The Japanese had tried major offensives aimed at taking Henderson Field, and once they had control of that, they planned to populate it with their own aircraft and spell the end for any US counterattack on their occupation of the Solomon Islands. It would also give them the ability to far more heavily interdict the US-Australia supply lines. Only heroic efforts by US forces on the ground through the middle of October meant that the airfield was still in US hands when Enterprise arrived. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been circling like sharks sensing blood for almost a fortnight. As well as the two big Shikakus, the smaller Zuiho and the mid-sized Junyo were in attendance. They were all awaiting the call that Henderson Field was finally in Imperial Japanese Army hands, at which point the plan was to fly off large contingents of their flight groups to immediately maximize strength available on the airfield, with other units like land-based fighter squadrons and twin-engine bombers gradually replacing the carrier groups once the latter were ready to fly in. On the 24th of October, less than a day after Enterprise had arrived in the general area, the Japanese Navy informed their Japanese Army counterparts that after a fortnight of waiting, the carriers would have to head back soon to refuel. Not wanting to be seen as the cause of the offensive's overall failure, the Japanese Army launched another assault that night, and assumed that it would succeed, telling the Japanese Navy that Henderson could be occupied as soon as dawn rose on the 25th. Unfortunately for them, when daylight came, the Stars and Stripes were still flying above Henderson Field, and Kincaid's carriers were racing in to assist. Dauntlesses were already warming up on the deck, and just after lunch, a Catalina spotted part of the Japanese formation. They were steaming southeast, heading for Guadalcanal, while the US carriers were east-northeast and heading roughly west. At the time of the report, the distance between the two formations was about 360 miles, already in theoretical strike range, and the two forces were closing at near highway speed overall. A dozen scouting Dauntlesses roared off of Enterprise's flight deck to regain and maintain the contact, while another dozen bombing Dauntlesses, 7 Avengers, and half the carrier's fighters prepared to take off behind them, with the idea being that they'd thus have less distance to cover when the scouts called them in. But the scouts couldn't regain contact with the reported Japanese formation, and the whole collection had to fly home after hours spent in the air as night began to fall. A combination of lack of experience in night flying and sustained time aloft meant that a Wildcat, 3 Avengers, and 3 Dauntlesses were all forced to ditch, with the Wildcat's pilot being lost, but fortunately the attack aircraft's crews were all picked up and returned to the ship. The carriers then pressed on overnight, closing the distance and hoping that the next day would bring better fortune. At 0600 the next morning, 16 Dauntlesses headed up for another search, operating in pairs, followed by 8 F4Fs forming a combat air patrol, and half a dozen more SBDs on ASW patrol. One of VB-10's SBD pairs reported seeing a Japanese Navy floatplane come past them going the other way, just over 80 miles out. But less than half an hour later, there were far more exciting things to talk about. A Japanese surface action formation with a couple of Congo-class battlecruisers at its heart had been spotted, and so the Japanese carriers had to be somewhere nearby. Back aboard Enterprise, a small contingent of Dauntlesses and Avengers were being warmed up. The day's orders meant that it was Enterprise's turn to provide the scouting line and the ASW screen, and that meant that Hornet would have to provide the bulk of the attack power. 40 minutes later, at 10 minutes past 8, a pair of VS-10 SBDs radioed in. They'd spotted a pair of Japanese carriers. The relative position that they reported meant that the two fleets had managed to close 160 miles in the hours of darkness. At 200 miles distant, this was a little further than the initial spotting range had been at Midway, but that could change very quickly. Both US carriers turned northwest and ramped up their speed as the attack formations began final takeoff preparations. The 2 VS-10 Dauntlesses decided, well, we might as well attack the Japanese formation while we're here, but they'd been spotted, and between the Japanese ships going evasive and the 2 Dauntlesses getting jumped by some of the Zeros on combat air patrol, they were forced to defend themselves instead of making combat dives, and then they had to make for home. 2 other scouting Dauntlesses heard all of these reports over the radio, and realizing that the needed contacts had been made, they headed over to see what they could do. With most of the Japanese Navy's attention being on the first 2 Dauntlesses to have bothered the carriers, this second pair arrived completely unnoticed, and although they mistook the smaller Zuiho for one of the Shikakus, they still put a pair of 500-pound bombs into the aft end of the carrier's flight deck, rendering Zuiho incapable of further flight operations that day. But just as valuable was the intel that they radioed out even as anti-aircraft fire and Zeros belatedly chased them, that intel being that the enemy carrier's flight decks were clear, which meant whatever strike the Japanese had prepared was already on its way. Hornet sent up 29 aircraft in her strike wave, while Enterprise sent 8 Avengers, 3 Dauntlesses, and 8 Wildcats. The majority of her F4Fs were being kept back for combat air patrol. Unfortunately, for the second time that day, Japanese Navy and US Navy aircraft crossed paths heading in opposite directions, but this time the Japanese Navy group was much higher in altitude, and a number of Zeros peeled off from the formation, executing a diving attack on Enterprise's strike group. The first any of the American pilots knew of anything was when VT-10's lead Avenger began to spin out of formation on fire. The Wildcats tried to assist, but they had been throttled down in a climb, weaving to try and keep pace with their charges, and so they started the fight with very little energy and no altitude advantage, whereas the diving Zeros had all the spare energy in the world. 3 Avengers in total went down, and several of the others were shot up to various degrees. The Wildcats' woes were added to when one of them found that its drop tank refused to release, and then said drop tank was quickly set aflame by a burst of fire from a Zero. Another managed to drop its tank, but thanks to complexities with the fuel feed system, the engine immediately died, which meant the pilot with the burning tank, Raleigh Rhodes, ended up following his embattled wingman down using the plume of burning fuel as an impromptu smokescreen until the latter managed to get his engine working again. Enterprise's surviving strike aircraft extricated themselves from the dogfight alone, with one of the F4F formations in company. The other 4 Wildcats stayed in the dogfight to buy time. 3 of those 4 aircraft would be shot down, and the last limped home flying a loose collection of holes that had formed the vague shape of an F-4F. The final score was 3 Avengers and 3 Wildcats shot down, with several more badly damaged, in exchange for a quartet of zeros. With fuel now a concern, all aircraft having burned off a fair bit in extricating themselves from the Zero's attention, Enterprise's pilots had to attack the very first Japanese ships they saw. Although malfunctioning Mark 13 torpedoes saved the Suzuya from anything more deadly than ammunition expenditure, the trio of Dauntlesses did manage to land solid damage on the nearby cruiser Chikama. But that would be pretty much it for Combat Air Group 10's offensive action in this phase of the battle. But it wasn't the end of the day for the pilots as a whole. While Hornet's group was going after Shikaku, the Japanese Navy strike group was about to hit the American carriers. Fate smiled on Enterprise as soon after the final air raid warning was announced, she entered a rain squall and was temporarily hidden from view, although this did leave Hornet as the sole recipient of the Japanese Navy's wrath. Unfortunately, the poor fighter direction that had plagued the US Navy at the Eastern Solomons was still somewhat in effect. The pilots were keeping quieter on the radio net, but the controllers made a deadly mistake. Instead of giving directional instructions based on absolute compass bearings, they defaulted, probably under stress, to giving bearings relative to Enterprise herself, and with the squall covering her from the view of both US Navy pilots as much as their Japanese counterparts, the attempts to direct those pilots at the incoming attackers were therefore about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Some of the Wildcats did manage intercepts at the last minute, largely by just heading for Hornet if they could see her, but it wasn't enough, and Hornet was hit hard. Meanwhile, down at sea level, one of the weirdest incidents of friendly fire was unfolding. A shot-up Avenger was making its way back to Enterprise, but the torpedo it was carrying refused to release. Understandably concerned about a damaged bomber with a live torpedo potentially crash-landing on deck, Enterprise ordered the Avenger to instead ditch near a friendly destroyer. They duly landed near USS Porter, and the big destroyer began to slow, only for lookouts to suddenly report there was a torpedo in the water. It seemed that the shock of ditching had convinced the torpedo to finally disengage, and it was now heading straight for the Porter. A couple of nearby Wildcats dove down and tried to strafe the torpedo, but they had to break off when Porter's crew opened up on them, thinking that they were hostile aircraft who were just shooting at them instead, with particularly bad aims. The torpedo ran true, and then became one of the very few Mark 13s of 1942 to actually decide to work for a change, and promptly blew a hole in the destroyer, which was fatally damaged. The destroyer still picked up the pilots, by the way. While all this was going on, another wave of Japanese aircraft was detected coming in. These split up, about half heading for each carrier, as Enterprise by this point had exited the protective rain squall. The Combat Air Patrol Wildcats were now almost entirely out of place, either still confused over where they should be, or else they were still orbiting over the stricken Hornet. And thus only 2 aircraft made the intercept of the 24 or so enemy aircraft heading for Enterprise. One of the pilots of the Vals, now screaming down at the carrier, had landed a hit on the ship in her previous engagement at Eastern Solomons, and now repeated the feat as the ship took 2 direct hits and another very near miss. The first bomb punched through the bow from about 20 feet aft from the front of the ship, but exploded outside the ship after exiting. Although fires burned in the bow for some time, there was only one casualty, a Dauntless gunner who was still aboard his aircraft when the explosion sent it bouncing over the side. The second bomb was far deadlier. It smashed into the flight deck 10 feet after the forward elevator, and either split in 2, or else exploded in the hangar deck, setting loose and activating one of the bombs that was being loaded on aircraft there. Either way, there was an explosion in the hangar, and then another in the officers' accommodation below. Both explosions started fires, wrecking a total of 7 aircraft, damaging several more, and killing at least 40 men. 2 survivors found their way out of the growing inferno down below. Bill Pinkney was a small man who served as an officer's cook. He'd been briefly knocked out, but managed to come to his senses. James Bagwell was a gunner who'd been wounded and concussed by the blast. Seeing that Bagwell could barely stand and would never make it up the ladder to safety, Hickney hoisted the larger man onto his shoulders and began to climb. At the top, he reached over and unknowingly touched a severed live electrical cable, and both men tumbled back down to the deck, temporarily knocked out, in Hickney's case, for the second time. Once they came around, he simply repeated the process, minus touching the live cable, and popped his shipmate through the hatch to safety. Then he went back down again to see if anyone else could be helped, but sadly everyone else in the area was already long dead. And so he climbed back up the ladder for a third time, tried to move to help out with general damage control elsewhere, and collapsed. Rushed away for medical attention, it was found that he'd accomplished all of the above, with third-degree burns to his hands, back, and one leg, plus multiple puncture wounds from varying sizes of shrapnel. Unsurprisingly, he would be nominated for, and receive, the Navy Cross. Perhaps more surprising is that not only did he survive, but he actually managed to make it to the age of 61, only passing away in the mid-1970s due to completely unrelated cancer issues. Shortly thereafter, though, a massive explosion rocked the ship. This was the near miss. The whole length of the hull seemed to whip, and anything not bolted down went flying. Aircraft hopped and skipped across the flight deck, one fell overboard, another tipped over into the gun gallery that ran along it, the gyro compasses lost some of their mercury, a fuel tank was breached, one of the main turbine mountings cracked, and the entire mast twisted around, throwing many of the radar and radio systems on it out of alignment. Deep below, 10 men in the forward 5-inch handling rooms found themselves trapped at their station, as water, foam, and debris, both metal and human, had drained down from above, flooding the compartment above them to a depth of 8 feet. They'd remained trapped down there for most of the day, as gradual water infiltration slowly rose above their waists, before damage control crews would eventually get portable pumps in, which drained enough of the compartment over their heads to let them get out. The reason it took so long to reach them was that the Japanese Navy was far from done with Enterprise. Despite the carrier and the nearby battleship South Dakota reaping a fearsome toll of the attackers, still more were coming. Next up was a wave of Kate torpedo bombers, which set up a perfect pincer attack from which there could be no escape. A similar attack by twin-engine torpedo bombers had put an end to the evasive skills of HMS Repulse almost a year earlier, and just earlier that day, other Kates had used the tactic to bring Hornet to a halt. But, once again, fate intervened. 7 Kates were coming in from port and another 5 from starboard, but the larger group, to port, was split. 3 ahead, followed by the other 4 some distance behind. By a mixture of luck and skill, the first 3 all went down to anti-aircraft fire in quick succession, allowing Captain Hardison a brief moment when the only threat was the 4 torpedoes that were coming in from starboard. He watched the wakes, made careful on-the-fly calculations, waited a long moment, and then ordered the ship to turn right full rudder. The bridge crew watched as the carrier threaded through the torpedo spread, with one of the Japanese weapons skimming past them not more than 10 yards away. But there were still torpedo bombers out there. Another was shot down and smashed into the bow of the destroyer USS Smith, which kept going despite the roaring flames, and chased down the South Dakota, using the rooster tails of the battleship's wake to douse its fires. Back on Enterprise, another torpedo was spotted coming in. The bow was already well past the interception point, but again superb ship handling saved the carrier. Another hard right turn, kicking her stern out just enough, this torpedo thus sliding aft by about 30 yards. Another 5 Kates now appeared astern, making to pass around Enterprise to drop in on her port side. But Captain Hardison had either clearly read up on Karga's tactics at Midway, or else it was a case of great minds think alike, and once again Enterprise was swung around hard to starboard, keeping her stern to the Kates for as long as possible, allowing the anti-aircraft gunners to down 4 out of the 5. The last gave up the game of Ring Around the Roses to make his drop from astern. Enterprise duly straightened out and let the torpedo overtake her to port. The ship, as it turned out, had been incredibly lucky again in more ways than one, as Lieutenant Swede Vejtasa, I think that's how it's pronounced anyway, had dropped back to Enterprise after helping in defense of Hornet. In his Wildcat, he'd spotted no less than 11 Kates heading for Enterprise, and his flight had dropped in on them, with Vegetasa claiming no less than 5 of the torpedo bombers and his wingman taking a 6th, reducing Enterprise's problems to the previously mentioned 5 remaining Kates. Along with a pair of Vals that he'd downed over Hornet, he'd claimed a total of 7 kills in a single engagement. Quite battered, with a hangar on fire and the forward elevator broken, Enterprise was now still the only option left for both her air group and that of Hornets to land. The second elevator had also temporarily jammed in the down position, and many returning aircraft were damaged and difficult to control, or low on fuel, or both. The LSO, Robin Lindsay, was faced with trying to guide this motley collection in to take the very first arrestor cable, if he didn't want to end up dumping aircraft down the hole that was currently number 2 elevator, all while Enterprise ducked and weaved as more enemy aircraft were reported incoming. Looking more like a mad orchestra conductor than a landing officer, Lindsay managed to get some of the aircraft down before being interrupted by the roar of anti-aircraft guns as 20 Vals came screaming out of the clouds. Lindsay threw down his guidance paddles, offered a stream of abuse at the incoming Japanese pilots that's pretty much entirely unrepeatable, but roughly translates to, please go away and die in a fire, preferably very far away from here, and let me do my job. Since most of the Japanese pilots didn't seem to understand English, he emphasized his point by climbing into the most recently landed SBD and opening up with its rear guns, something that was becoming a habit for random deck crew on the Enterprise. This time, the anti-aircraft gunnery was more effective than it had been in the previous dive bomber attack. Numerous Vals were hit, converting their dives into permanent plunges, and only one bomb came close, glancing off the ship's side and exploding in the water, although this did dish in hull plates and flood void spaces. Number 1 elevator, which had just started working, was jammed again, although this time it was in the up position, so that allowed flight operations to continue. However, another casualty of the various shockwaves was the main radar array. And so, with water spouts rising over the ship, spent shell casings and Japanese bullets bouncing everywhere, and the ship heeling this way and that like she was on a deadly rally course, Lieutenant Brad Williams, the radar officer, climbed up the mast with a toolbox and set to work trying to fix the radar as Japanese planes zoomed past him, sometimes passing beneath him. Initially, he tried to work on the antenna with one hand and hold onto the ladder with the other, but this accomplished very little, so he improvised a harness and lashed himself to the antenna, trusting his weight to this improvised harness and using his feet only for balance. He then set to work with both hands, gradually becoming mildly singed as a combination of wind-blown exhaust gases and smoke, along with the side effects of being in proximity to some of the 5-inch gun blasts and their muzzle flares, gradually curled the edges of his uniform and ate away at any exposed hair. When the glancing hit came in, the blast was so close that it deafened him. It would actually take weeks for his hearing to return, and it left him swinging in the air, suspended only by his impromptu harness. Eventually, he was rewarded with success, and as the radar screens lit up again in the radar control room, one of the technicians quickly set the radar to rotating again. Unfortunately, poor old Williams was still lashed to the antenna, and now began the first of a dozen unintentional sweeps through the air as the motor engaged. The loud anti-aircraft fire drowned out his alternate calls for assistance and promises of vengeance on whatever knucklehead was responsible for his current predicament, until a bridge officer noticed a shadow sweep past and ordered the radar stopped so the poor lieutenant could untie himself and get down. No sooner was Williams back on firmer footing than the radar picked up yet another incoming wave of dive bombers. By this point, the F-4Fs had expended their ammunition and most of their fuel. This was going to be a duel between the anti-aircraft gunners and the Japanese pilots alone. Several pilots broke off and went after other ships. The South Dakota took a hit to one of her main battery turrets, the light cruiser San Juan took a hit that went straight through her and out the bottom, temporarily knocking out her steering and sending the rest of the group scattering as the cruiser wheeled about out of control for a bit. But then it was all over. LSO Lindsay was able to get out of his impromptu gunnery position, find his paddles again, and the ship began to recover aircraft once more. Although the flight deck crew worked as fast as they could, some aircraft in the queue ran out of fuel while they were waiting and had to ditch. The escorting ships quickly getting very practiced at recovering aircrew. With number 1 elevator broken and landing aircraft passing over the other two, number 2 having been fixed, there was no way to strike down aircraft without pausing operations, and soon the flight deck was full. This was solved by launching 13 refueled SPDs with orders to head for Espiritu Santo. This freed up just enough deck space to land the last aircraft that was still airborne, an Avenger. With the Hornet having been given up for lost, and indeed finally being put down by Japanese destroyers later that night when they found the abandoned carrier waterlogged but still technically afloat, Enterprise was the only remaining US Navy carrier operational in the Pacific. Although dented, holed, and fire-scorched, the ship was just this side of operational, as long as you're being fairly generous with that term. Once more, with a mixed air group, she headed for Noumea to try and patch up the worst of the damage with the assistance of the repair ship Vestal. Some of the ship's after-action report on the matter of its anti-aircraft defences is quite enlightening as to the true state of US anti-aircraft capabilities at this point. Defense by anti-aircraft batteries. Again, fire control radar did not pick up any target. At no time since its installation has it been useful. Previously submitted recommendations relative to its modification are again stressed. The precision requirements necessary to put this equipment on an aerial target apparently cannot be met in action. 2. Neither 5-inch director picked up targets, although the rangefinder in Sky Forward was able to do so. 3. Complete power failures occurred on groups 1 and 2 5-inch. Partial power failures occurred on group 3. There were frequent rammer failures and electrical misfires on all guns. 4. The apparently unwieldy director firing system, augmented by numerous casualties which greatly slow the rate of fire, has made the 5-inch battery the least useful of the anti-aircraft for all except high-altitude horizontal bombing attacks. In local control, difficulty is experienced in getting both trainer and pointer on the same target. A new type of fuse, which it is understood will be available soon, may greatly increase the effectiveness of the 5-inch against dive bombing and torpedo attacks. 5. The performance of the 40mm in their first action was gratifying. Eventually, these guns may prove to be our best defense against dive bombers. Several faults now exist. Namely, empties jam in the chutes, local control is too sensitive, firing mechanism is not satisfactory, and our splinter shields are too high. Separate reports on these deficiencies will be forwarded. 6. The 20mm, in spite of its short range, was extremely effective and accounted for most of the enemy planes shot down by this ship. It cannot always get the dive bombers before they release, but it can keep them high and reap a fearful toll of those that press home their attacks. In a separate part of the report, under the heading General, it's noted 1. The advantages of operating 2 carriers in close proximity, if the operations are in areas where air attack is to be expected, are numerous. 1 carrier, alone under such conditions, forced to conduct morning and evening searches, combat patrols, inner and possible intermediate air patrols, has nothing much left with which to strike, and if long continued is likely to suffer considerable weakening of its air strength due to exhaustion of personnel and deterioration of material. If, of course, an air umbrella is furnished from other sources, and if it is reliable, then the picture changes. However, at present it is doubtful if such an umbrella exists in this area, and certainly a task force commander will be under considerable apprehension as to its reliability. Other advantages include availability of an additional carrier deck to receive planes from a damaged carrier, retention of 1 carrier's planes as a striking force ready for immediate launching, the institution of a duty system, whereby in normal cruising each carrier has days for upkeep and training of its group and other essential work. These and others have been discussed before, and it is not necessary to go into detail here. 2. When 2 carriers are operating together, each should have its own screen and supporting vessels, and should be organized as an independent task force or group. This applies to large carriers. The separation used in the operations now being discussed, about 5 miles, appeared very satisfactory. The distance permitted each group to maneuver independently while at the same time maintaining good visual contact for signaling and facilitated patrols. The precise separation when air attack is imminent is a question. The problem is how much separation will prevent sighting of both carriers if one is picked up. In the areas where we are now operating, 5 miles will not do it, neither will 10. It must be a really wide separation on the order of some 30 to 50 miles, and even this will not guarantee it. Therefore, unless conditions permit a separation in advance whereby the above can be achieved, it cannot be effected on short notice when attack is imminent. We must make our choice based on conditions present and likely to be encountered, weighing the advantages of close operations such as ease of control and of communications, economy of effort in air patrols and surface protection, including that against submarines, against the insurance against discovery resulting from a relatively wide separation. Again, the air coverage of the area to be expected from sources other than the carriers is a large factor. Now, after only 11 days, the ship was actually ordered back out into action. The crew, a batch of Seabees, and some of Vestal's crew were all still aboard working on her, but the simple fact was that despite the horrendous casualties that the Japanese Navy's flight crews had incurred, they still had at least 2 operational carriers that could make nuisances of themselves if they could find some more aircraft to fly. And indeed, less than a fortnight after the battle, VALs were already harassing US transports trying to land men and supplies. It was decided that for the moment it was best to place Enterprise southwest of Guadalcanal and send her aircraft in batches to Henderson Field, where they would refuel and then continue on up to attack Japanese shipping. As all 3 types of aircraft aboard the ship were also known to be operating from Henderson, this should in theory not give away the carrier's presence. On the 12th of November, it was reported that 2 enemy carriers had been spotted, and Enterprise moved in and began to prepare for action once again. She wasn't fully operational. Although number 1 elevator had been pronounced fixed, the captain refused permission to test it, on the grounds that if it jammed in any other position other than fully up, which was where it currently was, the ship would be completely incapable of flying off aircraft. That meant only 2/3 the rate of bringing aircraft up, and during landing operations none could be struck down until the very last aircraft had landed, but it was better than not being able to fly at all if the repair estimates on the elevator were wrong. Officers and men were also hot bunking as the destroyed accommodation areas were still burned out, and round-the-clock damage control parties kept an eye on several dozen shored-up bulkheads as a number of the bomb blast holes in the ship still hadn't been patched up, and the affected areas were still flooded. However, all the ship's air group found was a badly battered Hiei, a survivor of the previous night's furious surface action, and so they put several torpedoes into her, headed over to Henderson Field, reloaded, and repeated their attack. Some of the torpedoes didn't work properly, but enough did, and the battle cruiser slowed to a stop and began to roll over. Repair efforts on Enterprise continued, but no Japanese carriers materialized. Instead, the carrier's air group bounced between the ship and Henderson, hitting Japanese surface targets again and again. Some aircraft falling to Zeros that were tasked with escorting transport convoys, while Enterprise's own closest call came when a formation of G4M Bettys out of Rabaul came looking for her just after she had recovered her combat air patrol, leaving her completely vulnerable. Once again, though, luck was with them, and another rain squall hit the ship, while the bombers prowled about nearby before giving up and going home. With essentially all of her air group now at Henderson, Enterprise was released back to Noumea the morning after Admiral Lee sank Kirishima, an action that was close enough to Henderson that many Enterprise pilots were woken by the gunfire and spent the night wondering who was fighting who, and more crucially, who had won. Enterprise found herself back at Noumea on the 16th of November, and gradually, by either their own aircraft or by transport, her air group began to show up in turn, some having left their aircraft for the use of the Marine squadrons based at Henderson. Meanwhile, far to the north, Jeff Karam, shot down almost 4 days earlier, finally swam ashore after an epic swim. He was rescued by some of the natives of the island he'd landed on, which was one of the Russell Islands, and here he was fed and met up with a Marine pilot from Henderson who'd also been rescued by the natives. Both were kept safe from a nearby contingent of Japanese soldiers and were eventually picked up by a Catalina, with Karam eventually making his way back to his ship to fly once again. Apparently, that entire experience didn't faze him all that much, because he would live well into his 90s. By early December, enough replacement aircraft had arrived that Enterprise was underway again. There was something of a race going on. Enterprise was still patching up repairs to the ship, while a couple of thousand miles away at Truk, the surviving operational Japanese carriers were doing their best to qualify a new batch of pilots to rebuild their air groups. With word that Saratoga was heading back after repairs, the number 1 elevator was at last given permission to try working, which it did perfectly, and the first anniversary of American involvement in World War II passed without much incident. Although the ship would sail for further operations, the last major excitement was the Battle of Rennell Island, where the cruiser Chicago was hit and sunk despite the best efforts of the carrier's combat air patrol. With the Guadalcanal Campaign wrapping up, and word of another carrier coming south to join Enterprise and Saratoga, which would prove to be HMS Victorious, by April the ship was ordered back to Pearl Harbor, arriving back there in May, but to the disappointment of many, the ship would not be headed stateside. Carriers were still far too valuable for Enterprise to be allowed to stray that far from the combat zone. Instead, there would be about 6 weeks of overhaul in Hawaii, as until the arrival of USS Essex, which had been commissioned at the end of 1942 but wasn't due to be on the front line until the summer, it was just Enterprise, Saratoga, and Victorious against whatever the Japanese Navy chose to throw at them. But at least some more permanent repairs could be made, and with a new captain, Samuel Ginder, the ship settled in for another period in dry dock.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.